Okay, so the first illustration from your textbook, this is exercise S 5-4, and you'll find that it is essentially the same problem that is also in your homework in my accounting lab. So, but let's look at it. This is step one. They basically want you to get the total physical flow of units. And this is Babs and Soda. It says that they have 19,000 units in beginning work in process. It says during September, they had 100,000 units that were started into production, and then at the end of the month, they had 29,000 units left. So what I always do is I start off by writing out beginning work in process, which in this case, again, is 19,000 units. I then ask what did they start, and it said that they started 100,000 units. So you add those together, we know that that is 119,000. We call that total physical flow of units. Now, the other calculation to reconcile this is you have completed and transferred out. I'll just write completed, but it's technically completed and transferred out, and you're going to add your ending work in process. Those two should also equal your total physical. So what I always tell you, a little trick here, is just go ahead and copy that down. So we know the total physical has to be 119,000. We also know that ending work in process was given at 29,000. What they did not give you was what they completed and transferred out. So you have to know this relationship because you have to back into it. Essentially, that is a plug number. Once you subtract, you'll get 90,000 units. Okay, so the next illustration I want to show you is exercise S 5-6. And on this one, again, another problem. This they want you to get the equivalent units of production. And so this one is, it says the frying department of crinkled chips had 110,000 partially completed units in work in process at the end of March. It says all of the direct materials had been added to these units, but the units were only 68% of the way through conversion. It says in addition, 1,200,000 units had been completed and transferred out to the frying department, or I'm sorry, to the packaging department during the month. So here's the question they want you to answer. Number one, they want to know how many equivalent units of direct materials and equivalent units of conversion cost are associated with the 1,200,000 units completed and transferred out. Part two, they want you to compute the equivalent units of direct material and equivalent units of conversion associated with the partially completed units. And then number three is they want you to know the total equivalent units of direct materials and the total equivalent units for conversion for the month. So one little thing here you got to remember is that anything that has been completed and transferred out, that will represent 100% completion no matter what. So if I'm going to write out my schedule over here where I've got completed and transferred out, and I've got my ending work in process, all right? And so I'm going to label direct material and then conversion. What I always do is anything is completed, I know that's 100%. So if it's 1,200,000 units, I know that for both direct materials and for conversion, those numbers will always be the same. That's going to be 100%. So the answer to part one is 1,200,000. It's 100% complete. Part two is basically looking at ending work in process. And this one, of the ending work in process, they tell you of 110,000 that are partially complete, they want to know how much of that relates to material completion and conversion completion. Now, when they tell you that all of the materials had been added to these units, that means that the materials are 100% complete. So you'd put 110,000, again, 100% complete for materials. And then for the conversion, it's 68%. So for conversion, you take 110,000 and you're going to multiply that by 0.68, and that's going to give you 74,800. That would be your equivalent unit for the conversion. That would be the answer basically then to part two. Part three, you simply just have to add the totals together to get the totals. So for your materials, it's going to be 1,310,000, and for your conversion, it's going to be 1,274,800. Okay, so the next illustration I want to go over is going to be illustration S 5-7, and let's take a look at it. So we've got, it says McIntyre Company's work in process account had a balance of $68,000 at the beginning of the month, and it says 43,000 of this related to direct materials, while $25,000 related to conversion. It says during the May, the following costs were incurred. So think of everything down here. These are going to be cost added. You got product cost number 1, direct materials, direct labor, and then here's the overhead you're allocating. Here's your 3 product costs. They want you to basically summarize the total cost to account for, prepare a schedule that summarizes their total cost by direct materials and conversion. So essentially what they want you to do is set up direct material conversion columns. Again, this is for dollar amounts only, and you need to know, of course, beginning balances. And of course, they tell you your beginning balance for direct materials was $43,000. For conversion, it's $25,000. And then essentially, it's basically cost added. And so for materials, you're going to add $103,000 to that. For conversion, you're going to add the $12,000 plus the $150,000. Okay, and essentially that's all you're really going to have to do. And then, once you've combined those, that's what, 162. Once you've combined those, you'll get, this looks like it's $146,000 for direct materials. That's going to be $187,000 for conversion. And if you add those together, that's a total of $333,000 total cost to account for. Okay, the next one I'm going to show you is exercise 5-25A, which is essentially the first 2 steps. So down below, here's what they've given us. This is for Chelsea's chocolate pies. They've given you the physical units, and they've given you the percent complete columns for both direct material and conversion. And so basically, we'll start with, we don't really have to get the physical flow, but let's start as if we were going to do that. So I'm going to write this way up here at the top. So let's assume you've got beginning work in process, and you also would add in units started. We know that that equals your total physical. Then the next step would be to take your completed and transferred out and add that to your ending work in process. We also know that that equals your total physical. So if I plug in what we know 204,000 units for beginning WIP. We know that they started, looks like it's 1,015,000, so they told you exactly what they started. So that's 1,219,000 total physical units. I can copy this number there. So we're going to put 1,219,000 there. We know that ending work in process is 154,000 units. Your plug number is going to be completed and transferred out. You just have to subtract. So that's going to give you 1,065,000 units completed and transferred out. Now I'm kind of getting low on space here, so I'm going to drag this down here. So again, let's say you've got completed and transferred out of 1,065,000 units. You've got ending work in process, which we just figured, they told us that that was what, 154,000. Write that there. So using this as my base, direct material and conversion, let's now get the equivalent units. So remember, if it's completed and transferred out, that means 100% complete. So I'm just going to copy those numbers over for both direct materials and conversion. So each of those get 1,065,000. The ending WIP now is the numbers we need. We need the 75% for materials. So for materials, we'll take the 75%. You're going to multiply that by 154,000. I'm sorry, by 75% times 154,000. That's going to give you 115,500 units. For conversion, you're going to take the 80% times the 154,000, and that's going to give you 123.2. Okay, so and then once you get that, you simply just have to add these two together. For your direct materials, you're going to get 1,180,500, and then for your conversion, you're going to get 1,188,200. And that would be your second step. That's going to be your total equivalent units. Okay, so this is exercise E5-27A. It says complete the 5-step procedure in the first department. And again, notice in this case, we've got blending and packaging. They tell you that direct materials are added at the beginning of blending. So that's something that's important to know. And it says, and at the end of packaging, and that's in the cans, it says conversions are added evenly throughout the process. Data from the month of May for the blending department are as follows. So we're just doing the blending only, not the packaging. So in this case, the units are gallons. They give us beginning WIP, started, completed, transferred out, ending WIP. That's kind of cool. They gave us all the units. All the dollar amounts are down below. And so if you kind of did a quick reconciliation here, let's just write this up at the top, where you've got beginning WIP, which is 0. You've got what you started, which it looks like it's 8,400. So we know that our total physical flow for that step 1 would be 8,400 units. That's pretty simple. And then, of course, to reconcile that, you've got what you completed and transferred out, plus your ending work in process. Again, they gave you that. It's what, 6,200 units, and then 2,200 units. And of course, note that those add up to 8,400. So, you know, at that point, your units are reconciled. You need this part to get to the equivalent units. So to get to the equivalent units, let's draw that out. You've got completed and ending WIP, where you've got it's what, 62 and the 2,200. And of course, you draw your columns for direct materials and conversion. We know that if it's completed and transferred out, it's 100% complete. So we know that's going to be 6,200 for both. The question is what's going to be the ending work in process? One of the keys right here, it says 40% of the ending WIP is basically complete. So that 40% is for conversion. So if you were to take the 40% times the 2,200, you're going to get 880. That's where they got that. When they told you that the materials are right at the beginning, that means 100% complete. So for direct materials, just plug in 2,200. So the two numbers you're looking for here is 8,400 for direct materials, and you're going to get 7,080 for conversion. That's going to be your equivalent units. So then you say, okay, what's going to be my cost per equivalent unit? Because I believe they're going to want you to figure out the cost per equivalent unit as well. And in order to get that, you simply have to add up all your dollars. So for direct material and for conversion, if you look at it, beginning WIP was 0. So for direct materials, it's simply going to be 5,460. For your conversion, you simply have to add the 920 plus the 1912, that's 2832. And then at that point, you just divide by your equivalent units, which is 8,400 for materials and 7,080 for conversion. And what you end up getting is for direct materials, you're going to get 65 cents per unit. And for conversion, you're going to get right at 40 cents. And then, of course, once you've got that, now you can do your assignment of your cost. So one of the things I tell my students, if you just take the 65 cents and add that to the 40 cents, that's going to give you $1.05. That's a kind of a shortcut. So if they completed and transferred out 6,200 units, you could really just multiply that by $1.05. And if you were to do that, that's going to give you $6,510. Then when you go to your ending work in process, now we go back to these ending WIPs. For direct material, you had 2,200 units. For conversion, you had 880. And again, I'm referencing essentially that last row from step 2. And at that point, you just multiply by the individual cost per equivalent units, which is 65 cents for materials and 40 cents for conversion. When you do that, for materials, you're going to get $1,400. For conversion, you're going to get $352. And then if you were to add up these total costs, add up these three costs, you're going to get $8,292, which essentially is the same number as your total cost. Okay, so you definitely want to review the journal entry aspect of this chapter. This is exercise E529A, and I've got the answers in the next couple of slides, but essentially, guys, this is the same thing as job costing. The only difference is you're going to have multiple work in process departments. So if you look at letter A, purchase of raw materials on account, that's a simple debit to raw materials, a credit to accounts payable. So that basically is your product cost number 1. Part B is putting those direct materials into production. So notice you've got direct materials to assembly to finishing. Well, guess what? That's going to be 2 work in process departments that we're going to be using. I'll show you this on the next slide, but you'll be crediting your raw materials. So, but think of this as product cost number 1. Then notice you incur some, in this case, it's incurrence and payment of direct labor. And again, we know where direct labor goes. We know direct labor goes into what? Work in process. So you'll see that that'll be the same idea. We've got the incurrence of overhead costs. Again, you got your taxes, utilities, and you got some depreciation. Very similar to job costing. You've got the assignment of your conversion costs to the assembly department. Well, guess what? That's going to be work in process. Same thing for finishing. That's going to be a work in process. And then down below, everything else is basically the same as the previous chapter. You're going to complete, transfer out. You're going to have an exchange from one WIP account to the next WIP account. And then finally, when you sell it, it's going to go to finished goods and then finally to cost of goods sold. Okay, so again, just to kind of review these journal entries, you'll notice again, here's the first one. Here is your purchase of raw materials on account. Again, the same as job costing. So basically debit raw materials, credit accounts payable. On part B, notice you're debiting work in process. This is going to be for the direct materials. And then you credit raw materials. Again, exactly the same as job costing. And of course, the same on this one, debit work in process for finishing. Again, the difference is you have multiple work in process accounts. Again, if you look at letter C, this is your direct labor. So think of these as this is product cost number 1. Here's product cost number 2. It's essentially the same idea. Letter D, notice this is going to be your actual overhead incurred. And notice just like we did in job costing, we debit manufacturing overhead, and then you can credit the appropriate accounts. You have some property taxes, utilities, the prepaid insurance, that would have been an adjusting entry, and of course the depreciation. And then on the last part, notice again, if you look at letter E and letter F, again, they're combining this. They're basically combining your direct labor and overhead. This is your conversion cost. So of course the wages payable is the direct labor part of it, and then the assignment of your overhead, which is basically allocated overhead. Notice how they're going to be crediting overhead and debiting WIP. Notice everything still goes into WIP because again, this is product cost number 2 and product cost number 3. They combined it with conversion, and they did this both in letters E and in letter F. One is for the assembling department and the other one is for finishing, but again, it's the same idea. The wages payable, that's your direct labor, and then the manufacturing overhead, this is your allocated overhead, and so you'd credit the manufacturing overhead for the allocation, and of course you debit WIP for the allocated overhead. So just to kind of remind you on manufacturing overhead, in case you forgot, remember the debit part of manufacturing overhead always gets the actual, and the credit part of manufacturing overhead always gets the allocated or the assigned. So when they say in letters E and letter F, they assigned these costs, that's why they're crediting the manufacturing overhead account for that part. And then the rest of it, letter G, that's basically just the transfer from one department to the other department, one WIP to the other WIP. And then finally on letter H, you're basically finishing it. So you go from WIP to finished goods. That's like if I show you the T account visual on it, it's like saying we completed it. Now we're shipping it over to finished goods. And then eventually once they sell it, it'll go to cost of goods sold, just like you would have done in job costing.